Alrighty, recording is on. And sharing. And there's the slide deck. And I think Dima, you wanted to kick it off. I can kind of scroll through the slides as needed though. So you want to go ahead and kick us off, Dima?
Sure. So first of all, thank you to everyone. We're going to try to talk about, present the Infinite Industries as a project, but also try to talk about, what can open source mean in terms of signaling to the rest of the world that's not necessarily of the nerdy persuasion, right? Because it does, sometimes it confuses people, and sometimes it also allows us to kind of have a lot more of what we'll call decentralized conversation, right? So can we jump to the next slide?
Yeah.
Right. So first of all, what's Infinite Industries? So we do have a website over there. Right now, the website basically says, you know what, we're kind of closed down because we do not want to send people to any cultural events. But essentially, we're trying to figure out how to solve the issue of discoverability, right? Because most of the time, what happens with various cultural events is that there is the in-group, right? The folks who are putting the event on and their friends, right? And then there's the rest of us who are kind of going hey, this sounds really good. Wait, it's already over, right? Or why didn't I go to this? Or, whatever. One of my favorite signs on a gallery, albeit this was in New York City, was always welcome, never open, right? So, which again, a lot of times is really what the art world, music world, dance world, pick anything, really is kind of the message that goes out there is that oh, well, you should kind of know about this, right? So we're kind of going does how do we actually make discoverability work, right? And then on the, so just to kind of back up just for 1 second is if we're talking about, for example, platforms like Facebook, it kind of exacerbates the problem because it essentially says oh, your friend so-and-so is going to an event, right? And tries to promote events that way. But it actually, what it does, it amplifies the fact that you're still inside a network of people who are going to events. Yes, you're more likely to go, but you're less likely to discover this, right? And then we do have a variety of different, usually email blast, listserv type things that are connected to individual venues, right? For build up various lists and such, but at that point you have to triangulate between, let's say, 5 or 6 different ones, right? Can you guys hear me? I saw my connection kind of go down.
You broke up for a little bit, but I think I caught the gist of it.
Yeah, well, the gist again, you need to triangulate between 5 or 6 different email listservs, right? So that's both an issue from the user perspective, right? So, well, let's say, you're, again, trying to get 2 or 3. Can you guys see me?
Yep.
First, maybe wave to me if somehow my connection just drops.
Okay.
Okay, gotcha.
You're good.
Okay, good. So wave if it's bad. Thanks. So, but again, the idea is that you're either triangulating between multiple listservs or trying to go through Facebook, or we don't really have any other options, right? And then from the venue perspective, the problem is that every single time you're creating an event, you have to submit to 5 or 6, and that's the best case, different email listservs, right? Or various sites and again, Facebook events. So what's happening is that, for example, if you have to change an hour somewhere like, you know, like you go from 5 o'clock, oh no, we need to move our event to 6 o'clock. The problem is then it becomes this weird trail of like, oh, where did we submit this event to, right? Who has submitted this event? Can we change it in all 5 or 6 different places, right? So the idea is then create a central repository, so sort of a single source of truth from which we can get this information. But we definitely do have issues with centralization. So let's jump to the next slide. Right, so centralization is a little bit scary, right? Because in a sense, like Facebook is once again trying to do that. First of all, some of the community that's interested in arts in general is very skeptical of Facebook as, you know, as a corporation. But if you look at even smaller things in the design sort of cycle that they have, right, is like points to the fact that, for example, they want to keep you on their platform, right? So it's very hard to calendar a Facebook event. And then if we're sort of jumping from there, there's a lot of sort of, I think there's a couple of, I'll pick on Facebook right now, but there's a couple of other options that are also trying to kind of go like us, because we can show you this advertisement, or we can do this, or we can do that, and like try to figure out various different ways to monetize your attention. Okay. So where open source comes in, right, is specifically diving into these benefits, right? So one is code belongs to the people. So we're centralizing the data, right? But we're allowing people to like tap into the data that we've collected. We're also allowing people to just like take the source code and rewrite it and let's say right now, this is very arts and culture focused, but if someone wanted to create an analogous type of situation for like yoga, right, and different groups in different towns, they can do that. So we're at once kind of signaling centralization for everyone's benefit, right? But then also allowing much freer way to access the source code that's sitting behind it. So this is where the open source as a builder of trust comes in, right? This is next open source as a way to kind of bring in infrastructure to the specific community, right? So essentially saying like, yes, we will do this, but let's say the 3 people that are currently working and doing most of the changes to the project, like decide to stop doing this, someone else can come in, right? So users can change. I mentioned this idea that someone can step in and essentially restructure this project for like yoga studios or, you know, some other, I don't know, like pet meetings or things like that, right? And then comes in another builder of trust, the fact that we are nonprofit, right? We are actually 501c3, IRS registered, and all sorts of good stuff like that. So again, the idea is to give as few incentives to monetize people's attention. And that's a very important part here, right? Again, another builder of trust also opens us to grants. Right now, our whole infrastructure is provided for by the grant from Microsoft. All the email and such comes from Google. And then some of the advertising kind of things that flow into what we're doing is courtesy of a grant from Visit Lex. This also allows us to work with organizations such as Bullhorn, who's done a lot of the design branding guide work for us, and direct collaborations with Radio Lex. And currently we're working on some collaborative widgets and such with WRFL here in town.
Awesome.
Jump to the next one.
Yeah.
Right.
And would you like me to kind of pick up on this one?
Please.
Alrighty. So that's some of the benefits of being an open source organization and a nonprofit. But I also want to talk about some of the challenges here. It's not always easy. I think one of the big challenges is that volunteers are going to come and go. So we've had a lot of great contributions from a lot of great people over the time, but you know, some people stick around a lot longer than others. A lot of the people that have contributed are students who maybe are here for a period and then they finish school and they go off to do great things, but they don't work on this anymore, which is good and fine for them. But what we have to figure out then is how to transfer knowledge as people come and go. You know, so I think that's a problem for all organizations is onboarding. How do you bring new people onto the team, and how do you transfer the existing knowledge and culture of the organization over to those people? I think it's particularly hard with a scrappy nonprofit open source project. Some of the things I think you can do that really help with that, but that are a lot easier said than done, is having good documentation. I'd love to say we're there. We're not there. I'm going to pause for a second because I'm hearing an audio hiccup and I want to make sure, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome. So, so having good documentation, that's something we're working on. And I think that can go a long way. One of the things I've started doing lately is trying to produce Swagger documents for the API. In particular, I'm trying to produce documents that live both close to the code, but that can generate more public-facing documentation. But really, you need documentation at all levels. You need documentation that's going to be open to the non-technical types that can tell them a lot about what the project is. And you need that WD documentation that tells you how to use the project, how to get started as a developer, how to join, all that sorts of stuff. And of course, another challenge, which just feeds back into the previous challenge, is we have limited time. So most of us are doing this voluntarily on weekends, so we have limited time, and that equals a limited speed as well as limited scope. So there's things that, you know, in my day job that I can easily get done in a week or maybe a few days because I'm doing it, you know, 40 hours, sometimes plus a day, you know, 5 days a week. So I can blow through those things and I can tackle big features. But when your time is limited to weekends, you're going to forget things. It somewhat means that you have to kind of think about limiting your scope and ways to reduce the scale of what you're trying to do so that you can actually accomplish it in a reasonable amount of time and not just lose that thread and have it disappear. And then there is funding, which, as Dima mentioned, one of the ways to tackle that is grants, which we've had some success with. And the other way to tackle that is to inspire people to want to do this for free, which I'm doing because I think it's a great community resource. And so I think it's something that I want to have out there in the world. But it's worth touching on this because it's a challenge for pretty much every open source project out there. Some of them, there's a lot of different strategies. It's going to work better for certain types of projects than others. I know Dima mentioned earlier on the previous slide, there is a call out to the fact that this is, in a lot of ways, community infrastructure. What I've seen looking at the open source world is I think infrastructure projects, things that can be seen that way, work particularly well as open source projects because there's a vested interest in everyone contributing. What you want to do is try to show different interested parties how this is of value to them. And that's the reason, that's how you're going to inspire people to spend their nights and weekends contributing to this. And that's how you're going to actually leverage that community. Another challenge, all your dirty laundry is out there. So everything you're committing and pushing to that GitHub repo is public. So that bad code you wrote, it's public. I haven't been particularly concerned about this because I don't know. I've written a lot of bad code in my day. I'm over being embarrassed by that. I just like to get things done. But it's something you want to consider, and it can be a problem. It can especially be a problem, I think, if you start closed source and then you're trying to open source because you've sort of gotten used to obscurity. I think when you're open from the get-go, it makes that less of a problem. That kind of like ties into the next bullet point, which is security is hard for the best of us. No organization is secure as they should be. We all try our best. I think by virtue of having all your dirty laundry out there, if you're aware of some of these security things, I think it actually encourages you to do more of the right things because you know you can't depend on security by obscurity. You have to think about these things. But it doesn't mean you're not going to accidentally git commit and push private security credentials or tokens to your repository once or twice. It's going to happen. I've done it plenty of times. And once you've done that, it's out there. So you got to go and cycle those tokens. It's a pain, but that's something that's going to happen. It's something you have to watch out for. There's ways to help, processes you can put in place to help try to keep yourself from doing that. But putting the right processes in place also takes time, limited speed, limited scope. And then finally,
security one the hard way, right?
Yeah. And I mean, you have to do the best you can. It's really important and it's really hard. And it ties back to the last point there, which is maintenance. And especially if your open source project is a web service, it's never done. You're never just done with a web service. It always requires updates. It always requires maintenance. You have to keep on top of both the code itself, the dependencies of the code itself, as well as the runtime environment in which it lives, which means you need to think about logging, metrics, alerts, and just a whole nother level of security. In the past, I've often had a rule for myself that I don't do web services as spare time projects. I generally do interactive art exhibits because those have a limited runtime and then they're done. I broke that rule for this because I thought it was worth it and it seemed like an awesome project. Next slide, I kind of wanted to talk about then kind of going through some of having gone through some of the what we're doing and why we're doing it, and some of the challenges. I thought I'd talk now about the special sauce, the stack, the tech part of it, and a little bit about kind of what we're doing to try to meet some of those challenges. And a shout out to Cackling Hen here, which is awesome local hot sauce. I don't know how attainable it is right now given the pandemic, but normally it's sold at Doodles and Zim's Cafe. And if you can get your hands on it, it's awesome. So our special sauce though, basically what we're doing, as you saw on the first slide, is we have a website, which is currently that's showing events focused on Lexington, Kentucky, so arts and cultural events here in Lexington. That website though, the way it's architected is there is a client-side portion of it, which lives, kind of isolated in its own build process. That is all built on top of Vue/Nuxt, and then it talks to a separately hosted API layer, which in turn talks to a database which is implemented in Postgres. And then there is also a possibility there for third-party apps and sites to talk to that same API layer. And we're starting to work on some integrations like that for WRFL and hopefully for others to use. And that's kind of part of the point of why the web portal and the API layer is split up, because there's multiple levels on which this works as kind of a community resources shared infrastructure, right? Like one level is that you could fork the project and do something totally different with it, host the stack yourself. But the other level is that we're hoping that we can provide it a service through this API layer so that you're not having to solve that problem of hosting it and running the infrastructure. So, multiple places can subscribe to this API layer and retrieve events and things that are happening in Lexington and maybe ultimately other places in Kentucky or the nation. And so a little bit about the actual software dependencies of this stack. We are using end-to-end JavaScript. And I called this slide "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants" here because we have a lot of dependencies. I think Node is sort of infamous for having a lot of dependencies. So we're using Node.js, the big ones here. We're using Vue. We're using Nuxt, which Mathew will talk a little bit about later. Obviously, JavaScript as a whole. We're pulling on Express there for like the backend stuff, as well as a great library called Sequelize, which that pulls in migrations for the Postgres database. There's a framework around that, and it pulls in kind of a lightweight ORM. I think that migration support is really why I went with that one, because it's really crucial if you're going to have something that runs against a database. You need some sort of migrations platform. And as you see here, many more. This is me scrolling through the npmls there, the list of dependencies. Node.js projects quickly pile up. I'll comment on that quickly too. I think it's important when you take on a project like this, especially when we have limited time and limited scope, that you leverage existing resources. You really want to build on the open source libraries and frameworks that are already out there. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. Now, you do have to be careful because, as you see there, they quickly grow. Node is very much structured around this philosophy that you have lots of little libraries that you kind of chain together to do things, but that tail can quickly grow. So you have to kind of keep on top of those. I'll do a quick side plug here. There's a tool called Audit.js, which the company I work for actually backs. It is itself an open source tool, but full disclosure, I work for the company that backs it. But it helps you to audit the dependencies in Node projects and to see which ones have vulnerabilities that are known against them, as well as vulnerabilities against their dependencies. So you can kind of pick through that tree and you can see what things you might need to bump the versions of, or what dependencies might maybe not be so high quality that you may want to work out of your code base. So real quick, just touching a little deeper on the API portion of this. So I do a lot of the back-end work on this, so the API part. So as mentioned, it's an Express application. It's running it's running Postgres currently. When we first started this project, we did originally go with MongoDB because, it's Node.js, it's MongoDB, it's hip. We did a migration to go towards Postgres, though. I think we found, as a lot of projects have found that have tried Mongo, that even when you think your data is not relational, you often find that it is. So that's something you really got to watch with Mongo. I've done some big projects with Mongo. It has some nice things about it, but it's great if your data really isn't relational. Most data is to some extent, and as soon as it is, Mongo becomes very tedious to work with, I think. And a lot of the speed benefits it has kind of go away once you have to start making lots of round trips to the database to fetch related things and to update data across multiple places. Another thing here is we're using Auth0 for our user management. I think that's another good thing, is to, if you've got a scrappy project like this, don't roll your own auth. Leverage some sort of auth service provider. Outsource that blame. You don't want to in-house that. And I'll say a kind of cool thing about that too is that when you authenticate against Auth0, it gives you back a JWT token, or at least that's one model you can use. And what you can do if you have multiple services in a kind of microservices arrangement is, as long as each of those services has access to the same secret key to kind of decrypt those, they can all validate that JWT. So you can basically auth once against this service, and then you can pass that JWT to, say, the API, or as well as maybe if there's a different API that you're using, if you're kind of segmenting the different functionality, you can pass that same JWT and you can check that it's valid and signed and extract information from it behind any of those different services that you have running, which is nice. So I think I've already touched on this last part here. Basically, our API can stand alone on its own service, which is going to make it more reusable, going to keep the concerns separate. It'll also make this easier to scale if we were to gain a lot of traction. This API is stateless. Its auth is all contained in the JWT. So if there's suddenly, if we're wildly successful, which would be great, and we really had to scale this, we could, throw these behind a load balancer. They already are behind a load balancer, but it's just typically one process is enough, but spin up a whole bunch more, and it should be able to handle that. So next part of this, I'll pass this off to Mathew because I think he has a much better handle on the front end here.
I'll talk a little bit about the front end. So the front end, the web portal from that the diagram earlier, was originally what I've been calling a hybrid single page app. If you've done React or Angular or Vue and you've done a single page app where you have a client side router that does everything, that's really nice. Pages are really fast. It's not really good if you have pages that you want to be crawled well by a search engine. You've got the same blank index page coming down to the client. And if you've got to do an API call, it's not going to be able to finish rendering that page before the search engine actually wants to scrape it. So the initial version of this, we solved that problem by having a handful of pages, the actual individual event pages, the sign-up form for the email newsletter, server rendered like a classic web application, and then everything else was a single page app, and you could go back and forth between them. That was a great way to solve that problem. It's tricky with having to include different chunks of JavaScript on both of those pages, trying to share code between those things, trying to keep those server rendered pages fast. Just at the start, we used Vuetify to sort of get a quick, consistent UI based on material design up and running. Dima mentioned Bullhorn earlier. In 2018, Bullhorn donated some time to actually help us redesign the site. That was around the time I first got involved with the project. And then more recently, after that redesign, we replaced the hybrid single-page app approach with a universal or isomorphic JavaScript application using Nuxt, which is a framework built on top of Vue to help you do server-side rendering with JavaScript. It's sort of a best of both worlds approach where on the first request someone makes to your application, the server calls out to the JavaScript framework and renders all the HTML on the server like a classic web application. And then all that comes down to the client fully formed, and then the JavaScript framework takes over the page, and the client-side router takes over, and from there, it behaves just like your standard single-page application. Can I get the next slide, Chris?
Yeah.
This is what the original version of the web portal looked like. This was around October 2018, right before the redesign went live. As you can see, it's very material design. And we've already shown one picture of this, but can I get the next slide, Chris?
You seen it?
Yeah. And this is the Bullhorn redesign.
Which I think looks a lot nicer.
Yeah.
Not that the old one was bad. And that was not that wasn't the original. That's one snapshot in time. I think there was an even older, more different version of that, FYI.
The material one is the first one I remember. I haven't been involved with the project quite as long as Chris and Dima have.
I'm thinking of the very, very early version when it was a totally different purpose, when there was blockchain involved.
Oh, right. There was. It looked prettier.
Yeah.
But
one thing that that screenshot doesn't really show, it sort of shows it, but you can't see the full effect of it, is that a lot of our icons are sort of rough hand-drawn style, which is a very interesting effect.
I can probably load it up here. Make sure this doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
Might as well. You'll see, right now, unfortunately, everybody should stay home. So, and a lot of these events are probably canceled.
Yeah.
But you can see the page here. And for most people, you won't necessarily interact with this menu over here, but this is where if you wanted to, like you can log in. Like right now, the login functionality is really not something that public needs to do. This is more for like us and venues. At some point, there's been discussion that at some point you might be able to build personal lists and different things like that. But there's different
This sort of
things
shows
here
you
you
some
can
of
get
the
to.
hand-drawn icons in the animations.
Yeah.
Can you pull up the submission form, Chris, while you've got it?
Yep.
We've also got a really nice public-facing submission form here so that anybody can come in and post something they've heard about.
Yep. And this is open. Anybody, you don't need to be logged in for this. Anybody can submit this, but we do validate them. So they'll be submitted and then it'll give us an alert and we can log in as an admin and validate that. I'll go back to the slides here.
And to a point that Dima made earlier about calendaring, we have the option both there on the homepage and when you're looking at a particular event to download a calendar file in the standard format that pretty much every calendar program can put in your calendar. Or if you're using Google Calendar, we can take you to the link that will put it on your Google Calendar. Awesome. Ryan, to your question, yes, all submissions right now are being vetted manually, pretty much exclusively by Dima.
I like to say that the site's a bit of a mechanical Dima still. There's still a lot of Dima hand entering events, submitting stuff ourselves. The goal is to get more and more like of that kind of done through venues or the public or various events promoters, and to make that not so much something that's on us, but rather, as we've said, more of a community resource.
But it's come a long way from the days where Dima had to deploy a JSON file every week with the new stuff in it.
Yeah.
That was the very, very first version. Yeah.
MVP.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit at the very end about sort of how this project is working, but a lot of it is kind of like taking some of the best practices from the startup MVP-ish kind of world and saying like, like for example, if we don't have that many admin managing tools, let's break the rules and mess with production database. Or it's like again, generally horrible practices.
Says you.
Yeah. Sorry. But in certain cases, when we're looking at the life cycle of a product, we can do this kinds of stuff.
Yep.
And again, we'll sort of touch a little bit more about the speed, but generally this is something that in a startup-y world would be a week or two of finagling. In our case, this stretches into months, but again, just because the speed of development is very, very different.
Yep.
I'm going to talk a little bit before we get to the end about Nuxt and server-side rendering, as I've had a couple people bring this up. And this is one of the most recent large things that we did on the site was make this transition to Nuxt. Vue provides a lot of utility for doing the server-side rendering yourself. They have a really great guide for how to take an existing Vue application and do server-side rendering. Nuxt builds a lot on top of that so that you don't have to think about it. And it really did make the transition easier than had we done it by hand. Chris built out a really great proof of concept really quickly that sold us on this. The thing that I have liked the most about it is Nuxt layers on a couple extra lifecycle methods into over the typical Vue ones that makes handling setting up the page easier. It provides these two methods, async data and fetch, on your page or route level components, the ones that you would set as the component in your router configuration if you've done this before. Async data returns a promise if you define it that resolves with an object that's mixed into the results of the normal Vue component data function. And fetch does something similar. You return a promise generally what you're doing in fetch is calling Vuex store actions that need to make an API call to set the store up. And those have predictable behavior based on whether or not you're on the client or on the server when you do that render. And they block the page in a consistent way on both ends. So the server knows to wait, the server-side renderer knows to wait for async data in fetch before it finalizes the HTML to send down to the client. It's a lot trickier to do that in just plain Vue that you're server rendering yourself, because only certain component callbacks or component lifecycle hooks get called. And the advice is typically, when you first start doing Vue, to put things like that in your mounted lifecycle hook, but that's not called on the server. Created is, but it's called on both the client and the server. So if you've got your initial render coming down to the initial render data coming down to the client and Vue is taking over, you've got to check in your created lifecycle method, have I already done all of this on the server, and skip it. It can be really hard to sometimes to get a really interactive Vue component to render correctly in the server context if it's not particularly important to your application. If it's like our submission form, it's not really important that Google crawl that form correctly. You can wrap it in this client-only component that Nuxt provides, and it just skips rendering that until it gets down to the client and Vue can take over in the browser. That's really important, because if there's a difference between what the server renders and what the client would render, you can create really hard to troubleshoot issues. Vue does what it calls hydration in this situation. I think that terminology comes from React, when React first did server rendering, where when the actual HTML that represents the page as it would be rendered comes down to the browser from the server, the framework hooks in and it starts connecting existing DOM elements to the components that it's creating. That's the hydration process. If there's a mismatch between what's already in the document and what it's expecting, then it can error out in sometimes unpredictable ways. We had, right before we were ready to launch the Nuxt application, Nuxt version of our application, we had a mismatch related to the internal structure of a table on our admin page. And once we actually tried, we didn't catch it prior to doing a build and deploy to our staging server. And when you try to go to that page, the application just became unresponsive and we couldn't even get an error out of it. And the biggest challenge we faced with the Nuxt application and with doing some of our rendering on the server side is that it's really tricky to manage authentication in a safe way. Chris can speak to this a little bit better than I can, but it's just in general tricky to manage authentication in a Node application without accidentally leaking that.
Yeah, that's one of my pet peeves.
Into global scope.
Yeah, that's one of my pet peeve Node things. A little weedy, but yeah, I'll touch on that really quick, because if you are writing a Node application, one thing to be really careful about is the scope of variables, because Node applications are by design single-threaded. If you're working in a lot of other web application environments, like if you're working with a Java framework, typically they're going to spin up a thread for each user's request, and all the data associated with that request is going to be isolated in that thread. But in a Node application, everybody's sharing one thread. And one issue that we ran into with Nuxt early on, I forget what caused it, but it was a dependency we pulled down that normally set up in a certain way, but it's normally expecting to be running on client-side code. And that client-side code, it assumes it's going to set up a global environment and store things there. That's no good on a server, and it was actually basically had the effect that when one person logged in, everybody was now logged in as that person. It was basically capturing state and sharing it across all user sessions, which is not at all what you want. And it's unfortunately not the first time I've seen a bug like that in a Node web application. I think it's something that you really want to test for and be aware of if you're working with Node.
It was specifically the way we were using Axios to make API calls, where we we had previously been able
That's right.
to assume when we saw the user was logged in that we could set that as the default authorization header on our
Yep,
requests.
that's right.
But
That's
you have
yep.
to be extremely careful doing that on the server
Yep.
because when you do that, everybody's logged in. And interestingly, that didn't get unset if you then logged out. So once somebody logged in, everybody was logged in as you until somebody else logged in.
Yep.
Even if you logged out, you were still logged in as you.
Yeah, that's right. Axios was basically encouraging what I consider to be an anti-pattern on a node web service, but it's really common on the client, which is that you'll have like a single instance of something like Axios in this case, and you'll set defaults on it, which makes it nice because then later you can just call axios.get and it passes through those things. But you do not want that on a web service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so last one, we're going to kind of touch on some overall observations and things. I do want to circle back to one thing I forgot to talk about earlier that's worth mentioning. Dima kind of reminded me of it when he was talking about speed. But going back to the onboarding, and this maybe fits into observations too, tests are your friends. Now, it is hard to write tests, especially with that limited time and limited scope. And very early on, when you're moving fast and breaking things and like hand editing production, maybe you don't really have time for that. But I'm not finding the right point in time to insert them is more art than science. But if you can get tests, it will really help with onboarding. Because like I know if I'm going out and I want to contribute to an open source project, one of the first things I want to be able to do is I want to be able to run the tests on my machine, see if they work, do the thing I'm trying to do, run the tests again, see if I broke things. If I have to run the thing, install it into a project of my own, figure out how to hit all the code paths, make the change, run my thing again, that's way too much work and I'm probably going to give up. So having those tests is really new user friendly, and it helps with that speed because if you can make changes, run tests that you trust, then you know that you can make those changes and you can deploy them. And then the final thing there is going to be also having that deploy part, which is one of the things we've been working on. You want reliable deployment process. You want to be able to just very quickly say deploy to staging, deploy to production, and know that that's going to work and work the same every time. A lot easier to do in a 9-to-5. You know, I'm used to being at more enterprisey places where we've got, you know, a complicated AWS setup and we have hooks in our Git and we have an ops team, and like I basically push to Git and it builds a Docker container and it sends it to some sort of, you know, Kubernetes style cluster and magic happens. And that's not what we have, but we're getting closer just with crappy bash scripts and SSH and tools like that. There's lots of different levels you can take this. There's tools like Ansible and stuff that you can use that can like kind of one up that. I think Ansible is the one I'm thinking of. There's various tools like Chef and Ansible. I forget. One of them is basically one up on crappy bash script because it uses SSH, but it has like a descriptive language. Anyways, that's a shout out for that. But otherwise, so some other takeaways here that y'all have.
Sure. Documentation is difficult.
Yeah.
I'll read right off the slide.
And always difficult, and always will be difficult. I think that last one there, you know, one of the things we found is that with this limited time, it makes like larger rewrites even harder. Large rewrites are always hard, but when you've got limited time, if you have to do a big refactor, it's just painful. And I don't know any way around it, but it just is what it is.
I think it's really important to limit the scope of those larger rewrites when at all possible, because it's really hard to keep going when you've only got a couple hours a week to work on it and you've got so much to do. Like when we did that, when we did the redesign based on Bullhorn's work, that was right when I was first involved, and I really wanted to do some sort of server-side rendering solution instead of the hybrid single-page application because it made some navigation things difficult. And I'm really glad in retrospect, based on how long the server-side render rewrite took, that Chris and Dima talked me out of that.
Well, and it's also, one thing that's kind of important in terms of initial really crappy code, like, I'm responsible for most of the crappy code in the project. But, when we're just trying to figure out, like, hey, do people even want this around? Like, what's up? Right. So that was, again, kind of Vuetify with Vue with some very questionable state management or not. Right. Because one of the things, shout out to Vue for being like an awesome framework. However, like if I have to like whine a little bit, it's like super not opinionated until it comes to state management. And then it just like forces all of its opinions on you, like at once. And you're just like, oh, right. And this is also where Nuxt was very helpful, because from the very beginning, it's pretty opinionated. And we were able to kind of deal with essentially one set of opinions instead of like three. Myself not being like the most experienced dev, I think the very first time that we put together this app, I think I had maybe 2 or 3 different ways to communicate between different components that were implemented in the same project. Again, it was just like, hey, here's where emitting vents was just faster. Here's where using some of the view hooks was faster. And I was just kind of like going as fast as possible again, like and to get a prototype out, right? But I think what's really interesting, right, is again this sort of startup life cycle where you write your prototype code and then you're just like, bleh. You don't want any of that prototype code to be around. The scaling up, right? I would say even it goes beyond refactoring, right? Sort of almost replacing your code base that needs to happen there.
Yep.
Does take a lot slower.
Yep. And some of that needs to happen on the API side too. I'm responsible for all the code there that seemed clever at the time that I now can't read. And a lot of that was about saving time, right? Like the code there, I would say, is very dry, which they often say is a good thing, but you can be too dry. That's like, basically don't repeat yourself. So there's a lot of utility things I wrote in there to try to make it really easy to add very generic new endpoints that kind of just give you, stick this endpoint here and you get a basic format like get, push, post, and it's kind of a standard return type, which is good, but it's also like it became really dense and hard to read, and because I had to keep tweaking things and passing in more parameters, and it needs some love. So that's something I need to work on, or maybe one of y'all wants to jump in and help me work on.
It's a really clever design, but without good documentation, it's really hard to wrap your head around how it's working and to keep your head wrapped around it.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a really great question, I think, that popped up in the chat. It's like, are large refactors because of adding new features or new ideas from people turnover? I think most of our really large refactors, or I guess, again, like in some cases, really rewrites from scratch, come from the fact that it is kind of Dima behind the scenes on a lot of things, right? So things that are very hands-on, like I mentioned, I think actually, Mathew, you mentioned the fact that I was pushing out like a JSON list to straight to GitHub for the first, a couple of months, just to kind of figure out, like, again, like, is this a good idea or not? Then I think until fairly recently, I was also like manipulating quite a bit production database, right? To again, to basically say like, hey, we actually need to deal with some of the, in our case, some of the front end features that we needed to get in front of the users, right? Where I was just like, fine, like I can mess with the database, right? But this is like when we start substituting an actual text solution for the mechanical Dima, right, in the background. At those points, we really needed to up our game.
Yeah, and I think it's like a combination of those things, right? Because some of it is we want to add new features, or maybe even features that were on the roadmap, but that we haven't implemented. But maybe things weren't always architected in the best way to accommodate those features. And I don't know, every project I've been on, at some point you have to do some major rewriting. I always think of writing software as kind of like playing in sand, and you might build this nice castle, but the tide's constantly coming in and trying to wash it away. And I don't know, it's very malleable sometimes in ways you don't want it to be. And you always have to kind of reshape things. And
there's some things like if you're going to implement a new design, a new UI design, that's just inherently large.
Yeah. And you can, things that help with that is, keeping concerns separate, like keeping the API separate from the front end, and making the front end very modular, having different components. But that in of itself is a challenge and takes time and energy, so you don't always do it right.
Well, and I think, again, the sort of the issue of product versus good code. A lot of times, and again, like I'm the responsible guy on a lot of those kinds of changes, but like how do you quickly test out an idea, right? Versus writing good code from the very beginning, versus then bringing it back into the core of the project, and then also fortifying it with tests.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really tough to judge that.
Yep.
I don't think there are any hard and fast rules about how to go through that particular product development kind of centered process.
Yeah. I think you just have to do it and then see where you're the most annoyed. And when you're annoyed enough, you'll write tests. But if nobody's using it, you won't write tests because you'll get annoyed and you'll just stop doing it.
Yeah, so I think there's a related question here, right? You mentioned a desire for more tests. Are you using any tools, frameworks for that today, or have any in mind?
Yeah.
So on the web portal, Nuxt ships with support for doing jest testing on your front end, which I've been slowly adding some more tests. We really didn't have any prior to that test individual UI components. We're still we have a ways to go there, but I've made some progress. We've also been using kind of the first real front end testing we wrote was with a framework called Cypress, which is conceptually really similar to Selenium, but it uses sort of its own WebKit context that it can spin up. It has a lot of really nice tools. It's definitely a lot easier to get up and running compared to Selenium WebDriver. But that was some of the first testing we did was UI tests. We have one particularly large, generally you would not want to do this with a UI test. We have one very large, really end-to-end from somebody pulls up the submission form to someone has gone in and verified the event and it's now on the front page.
Yeah. I think it's good to have like at least one test like that. You don't want to go too heavy on those. I think of it as a pyramid. You want like a ton of unit tests and then a handful of mid-level tests and then one kind of end-to-end. The Cypress, I'll say, like the big distinction between it and Selenium is it's not really doing a full end-to-end test as in the sense that Selenium is, because it kind of mimics what Selenium does, but it does it by injecting stuff into the JavaScript of the page. So you're actually kind of controlling that page through the JavaScript, whereas what Selenium does is it actually manipulates Chrome itself. It's controlling Chrome. So it's sitting one layer further out. So there can be some gotchas with that, but it's been working fairly well on this project. I myself often go for Selenium instead, but that's just a personal preference. They both work fairly well for what we're trying to do. And on the API side, we also have a few tests that are using Jest and a little plugin that makes it a little easier to do kind of like API calls and then test responses. And those are kind of, it's more of an integration test. It's some of that, again, this is where some rewrites could help, because some of that it's hard to kind of get in and unit test, but you can kind of unit test it at the level of the individual API endpoints. It's not really a unit test, you know. So there's some tests there which stand up a database and populate it with some things and hit the endpoints and check responses. A lot of that needs more of, and the thing we haven't done yet, which really needs to happen at some point, is to integrate the tests into like the build process, so that, you know, tests that you have to run manually require a lot of discipline, and developers aren't good at that. And so it really needs to be part of your build and deployment process. We're getting close to that, but it's not been fully implemented yet.
Yeah, I think we've all three, at some point, even fairly recently, we've all three pushed something that broke some aspect of the test because we didn't think to run them before pushing them.
So there's no point in having tests if you don't run the tests.
Yes.
Yep. Exactly.
There's been more than once that I've run the newer unit test and then not thought to spin up Cypress and run the big end-to-end test, and I've missed screwing something up along the way.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. There was something really funny I did recently doing that. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, but yeah, it's easy to do. It's easy to think, oh, I just did this one little change. This doesn't affect anything else over here, and then push, and then yeah. But yeah, if you make that part of your process, it's a lot easier. Thought I heard somebody trying to say something, but maybe it's background.
It's probably my daughter. She was just shouting.
Ah.
So I wanted to ask you guys, though, have you looked at the GitHub actions to use in your build process? Because that might be exactly what you need.
We've talked about it. We haven't done it.
I recently set some of those up at my work. I have not done it yet for Infinite. One of the particular challenges we have, going back to the challenges we have with onboarding, is we talk to several things. We have a Slack integration for a couple things. We use Bitly to create shortened links to events after you create them for sharing. We have a couple other things that we talk to, and we have AWS for storing images. So all of the things that you need there to actually connect all the infrastructure up has to get shared out with a new person, and has to be available to if you're going to run the tests in a remote environment. So I haven't sat down to figure out how I could get all of those secrets.
Yeah, how you mock all those things. Well, and or ideally not those secrets, but equivalent secrets to a different.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, like some of those things you could mock, like you can mock AWS, but then you got to make that part of the test process. You have to make sure you're standing up local stack. If anybody doesn't know, is service that AWS provides, and you can stand that up and you can mock pretty much everything AWS does for testing purposes. Pretty useful, but also it's more time and energy and like glue code that you have to write in order to facilitate that kind of testing.
And to really get the full benefit out of those end-to-end Cypress tests, you really do need to be talking to the real thing.
I think that's debatable, but it depends how deep you want to go, right? Like I think there's utility in maybe, so we have a staging environment, right? Which is essentially as close to the real thing as you can get. So one thing that could be useful is to have a test that we run straight against staging. But of course, those sorts of tests have limited utility because you're limited in what you can test, because you're limited in what you know about the environment. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing we could benefit from, but we're not quite there yet, is to where we mock everything but our stack, the stack we control. So you mock Probably not the database. You can stand up a database, but have it be blank and control what's in it. But you mock like local, use local stack to mock AWS. Maybe you mock Bitly, or you at least have a test Bitly. You mock as much as you can. And then you're just testing like your API, your front end, and anything kind of in between there. But it's hard to get there. I don't know.
And hard to get there on a few hours a week.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks, guys. This was great.
Yeah. And so
I would. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Well, you can go ahead and finish up there. Yeah.
I was just going to say, this was awesome. I owe you guys a beer. Normally we'd head over to Main Street, but given the state of things, we'll have to keep it for another time. But this was fantastic. Thanks, guys. And thanks a lot, Chris, for doing the work to get this going. The virtual event worked out very well, so I'm pleased. I'm happy to do the user group this way and know that it'll work out just fine.
Awesome. And all I was going to say was kind of on that note that I'm going to stop the recording, but I wouldn't mind hanging out here and having some virtual beers. I've got a couple beers left before I run out and the apocalypse implodes all around me. But I'll stop the recording.